Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
And as we mentioned earlier, we are now on the threshold of, well, Pesach. With Shabbat HaChodesh, with the Shabbat that gets us in the right frame of mind as we head quite rapidly towards the month of Nisan. We are all hearing the alarm bells going off that Pesach is around the corner. Less than 3 weeks if you want the official update. Which I know fills some people with a bit of dread. Depending upon how you prepare for Pesach, less than 3 weeks may not seem like enough. But I want to try and put a few minds at ease, do a little quiz, a little review of exactly what needs to be cleaned for Pesach. We all know that we have to get rid of chametz. Very important mitzvah, one of the first that we receive as a nation in the entire Torah. Even while we were still in Egypt, we are being given these instructions. And so, of course, we have to get rid of chametz. What is chametz?
Leavened bread.
Leavened bread. Take off the word bread. Leavened, but what actually needs to be leavened? And what is the process of leavening? Well,
Yeast.
what's that?
Yeast.
Not yeast. Yeast is one way to make something rise, but you can still have leavening without yeast. Indeed, in the ancient world, most people did not have little containers or packets of yeast that they could add to their bread. They would keep a starter from the last batch of bread to try and build up that, what we would call sourdough, as their main chemical reaction for helping it to rise. But with our little bit of baking memory now hopefully stirring and rising up in us, yes, how do we get bread to rise? Well, we mix flour and water and wait. That's the essential process for leavening. Flour plus water plus time. Well, we still need flour and water because without that, well, we couldn't survive for most of human history, as those were the basic ingredients of bread that were needed for all time. But we had to make sure to cut back on the amount of time in order that it wouldn't rise. So, flour plus water rapidly being mixed, and within about 18 minutes into the oven, now you're making matzah rather than bread. So, rather than what we would call bread. Remember, though, that matzah is a type of bread. It is a species of bread, if you will. But again, leavening only happens for Passover purposes if it's made from one of the 5 grains: wheat, oats, rye, spelt, and barley. Now, most of us aren't out there eating most of those things, but if you happen to enjoy them, God bless you, and make sure that them plus water also doesn't have time to rise. So far, so good. So that means if it doesn't contain any of those ingredients and it wasn't processed in a manufacturing way that included some of those ingredients as well, that's the difficult aspect of the modern world, then you're perfectly fine for Pesach. So, potatoes, fine for Pesach?
Yes.
Absolutely, no problem. You'll check your Passover approved products and tons of them now have potatoes. We don't know what people did before the 1500s and the potato was introduced to the Jewish world. Potatoes are good. Carrots? Yes?
Yes.
No?
Yes.
Fruits and vegetables in general? No problem. Fish? No problem. Meat? No problem. We're all, this is not so hard at all, right? Okay, but let's get back to the hard part. Cleaning. True or false? Before Pesach, you need to wash everything that is in your linen cabinet.
False.
False. You do not. That's called spring cleaning. That's not called Pesach cleaning. And you are more than welcome to do the spring cleaning. I just always recommend that you wait until after Passover to do it so that you're not adding work on top of what can already be a stressful time. We don't need to clean everything in our linen closet because, and this is my assumption, you do not normally eat in your linen closet, and therefore there is unlikely to be large crumbs of chametz somewhere in your linen. Now, you know you. If you're the kind of person who just wraps up the tablecloth after their lovely deli sandwiches and shoves it back in the closet, then yes, you will need to take that, shake it out, and give it a clean. But if you're the kind of person who keeps basic, minimal hygiene, you're doing just fine. Likewise, do you need to clean all of your garage shelves before Pesach?
No.
Nope. Again, if you happen to use the garage shelves as storage places for large loaves of bread, then yes, you're going to need to give them a little bit of an inspection. But like most people, I'm guessing you don't keep big bundles of bread just stacked willy-nilly on the shelves in your garage. So that is not needed. True or false, you need to check your attic.
False.
False. You need to check your closet and all of your clothes in the back of the closet.
False.
False. Again, if you know that you are in the habit of putting sandwiches in your pockets and leaving them in your clothes, then by all means, please check your clothes, and you shouldn't have to wait till once a year to do that. But for most people who don't carry around food in their pockets and who wash their clothes with any kind of regularity, your closet is not something that needs a good check. Your stove before Pesach, does it need to be cleaned and examined or not?
Yes.
Absolutely. I am guessing that you're using your stove for something called cooking and baking, and therefore absolutely it needs to be examined and checked. Do you need to go over it with an angle grinder or a belt sander?
No.
Absolutely not. You just need to make sure that it has been wiped clean, that any debris that is in there is no longer edible. Run it through at its highest temperature. Most of us now have self-cleaning ovens, which makes that even easier. And boom, your oven is now ready for Pesach. You can see, this is not so hard, right? The same thing for your countertops. Just need to give them a good wash, give a good clean, and you're back in business, ready to go for Pesach. Your pots and pans, assuming that they are the kind of thing that can withstand the normal heat that you're using them for, no problem. Use them to the heat that they normally are having. Most things that go on top of the stove, that simply means filling them up with water, getting that water up to a nice big roiling boil, and then letting it bubble over a little bit around the edges. If some things can fit in that big pot that you're using, great. Now you just have to dunk things into that big pot. Please be careful with your fingers. They go in, they come out. They are now ready for Pesach. Does this sound too hard? Not so hard. And we will go over as we closer to Pesach with more of the details. I'll send out the guide that is prepared by the Rabbinic Assembly each year to give you any updates about products that may or may not be a little different in their manufacture than last year. But honestly, getting ready for Pesach physically is not that hard. In fact, in the ancient world, it would usually take an afternoon. We'll talk about that and why that took only that amount of time, a little bit more in tomorrow's Devar Torah. But for us, even in the modern world, we don't have too much that needs doing for Pesach, provided we're living a relatively normal life and moving our food around in our house in relatively predictable ways. Which means we have more time for doing the real work of Pesach, which is the spiritual cleaning, the spiritual housekeeping. Yes, I know most people think of this as being a uniquely Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur act, but Pesach too is a very important time to sit down and to reflect on who am I? Where am I feeling bound? Where am I feeling the pangs of entrapment, of being a slave to something that is unworthy and that I should not be serving? And how can I break free? Now, I will say that I have found a direct correlation that many of the people who complain about the amount of time and effort it takes to prepare for Pesach and the Seder also complain that they don't have enough time or energy to do that self-examination. Rabbi, it's hard enough getting everything ready before Pesach. How can you possibly expect me to do the soul searching, what's called the cheshbon nefesh, the spiritual accounting that I do for high holidays? I'll do that before Rosh Hashanah, because then, I don't have to worry about the cleaning. Well, that's kind of the point. Sometimes we use the physical act of cleaning. Sometimes we use the intensity of cleaning to avoid the more difficult and more important act of examining ourselves. It is much easier to stare into the oven and to try and scrape every last bit of black stain off that wall than it is to stare into ourselves and try and look honestly at what inside of us should be left behind in Egypt this year. It is much easier to try and lift up the refrigerator and clean the coils behind it and all of that, again, totally unnecessary before Pesach, than it is to lift up our own spirit and say, what is it that I am going towards this Pesach? What am I leaving Egypt for? What is it that this freedom will give me in this time. This is one of the burdens of our wonderful religion. We have so many things that we must do with our hands that very often we forget the things we must do with our hearts. So please understand that Pesach is primarily about our spiritual freedom and liberation, and secondarily about making sure our house looks spick and span. Yes, the mitzvah of ridding ourselves of chametz and avoiding its consumption during Pesach is a very important one. But it is not hard to fulfill that mitzvah. Do not become obsessed with it, nor shy away from Pesach because you believe it too onerous. Instead, use that time as brief meditation and allow yourself more time to properly reflect on what it is that is still holding you captive and how you will lay it down and walk away from it, just as we left the land of Egypt those years ago. Shabbat Shalom.
Rabbi,
Yes.
just out of curiosity, how much of the bread can you not have to get rid of because of the contract that you sold it?
Okay, so for Mechirat Chametz, and I'll be sending out the emails about that, for the sale of Chametz, which is an additional important aspect of our modern consumer culture, because we have too many items which have Chametz embedded in them that cannot be cleaned. More on that for those that are interested after services. But there isn't a shiur, there isn't a measure of how much Chametz you can sell. In the classical world, bakers would sell their entire bakery because there was no way to make a bakery kosher for Pesach apart from tearing it down to the ground. And obviously that was not going to happen each and every year. So there isn't a minimum or a maximum for how much can be sold for the Mechirat Chametz.
So theoretically, you would have to get rid of any bread, in theory.
Theoretically, you wouldn't have to get rid of any. However, most people still like to remove the more egregious examples of chametz. So that half-eaten loaf of bread that is sitting there on your counter, don't sell it, trash it. Or if you are really looking ahead for things, work down through your chametz so that by the time Pesach comes along, we're not throwing away usable food. Because God forbid in the modern world we should feel so blessed in our abundance that we forget that throwing away food is still a waste, and that is also a mitzvah to be upheld, that we do not waste, and even more so when so many others are in desperate need. So yes, technically you can get anything taken care of through Mechirat Chametz, but I do recommend actually getting rid of the more egregious examples of chametz. If you have specific questions, please contact your local rabbi.